Talk a little bit about the consistent pattern that Trump's reaction this morning to this protest and this attempt to topple a statue. What does that consistent reaction tell you about Trump's attitude toward the larger issues in play?
And what Donald Trump has made clear, John, is that the red meat for his campaign is stoking racism and doing it at the expense of what has become a much more positive discussion in this country about what we do about hate. And that's something we should be encouraging and celebrating as we see 3/4 of the country, without regard to party or race, saying we have to grapple with our history of racism. Listen to how Donald Trump talks about it. They are trying to take down our monuments. And that is such a striking way to pose this when we're talking about we're literally talking about Confederates. We're talking about Robert E. Lee. We're talking about literally a time when the country was fighting about who it is and whether it stands up to its creed of equality. He did this in Tulsa. He talked specifically in Tulsa about how everyone there was lucky that he was their president because he was going to preserve their heritage. It wasn't our heritage. It wasn't a call for us to think about all of the tremendous leaders we've had over the course of our history in this country that have elevated our ability to become a more perfect union. Instead, he has sought to get votes based on dividing, creating fear, and othering us.
Eugene, you columnized about this. I want to read a little bit of your own dulcet prose back to you here. You wrote that there's no earthly reason this nation should be defiled by Confederate statues. That's your piece. There is no earthly reason that any of the nation's public spaces should be defiled by statuary honoring generals, soldiers, and politicians who were traitors, who took up arms against their country, who did so to perpetuate slavery, and who, and this is an important point, were losers. And I think you mean that in more than one way when you call them losers. Talk about why that's an important point in this context we're discussing.
Well, it's important in the historical sense because they lost the Civil War, and these monuments are an attempt to these monuments were generally erected around the turn of the 20th century, decades after the Civil War. They were erected at a time when the South was, had strangled Reconstruction in its crib and was imposing Jim Crow repression, and so this was these monuments. Taking down Confederate monuments is not destroying history. It's actually presenting the real history, because the monuments themselves were an attempt to distort history and to tell a false story about the Civil War and about how it ended, and actually even to the point of about who won.
Right.
And in fact, the South lost.
Right.
And I guess the other meaning of it, of course, is that Donald Trump is associating himself with the losers in this this historical episode.
Maya, I want to ask you this. I really stuck out when I read Eugene's piece, the fact that he refers to these Confederates as traitors. He says generals, soldiers, and politicians who were traitors. It struck me, of course, they were traitors. That's what what the Confederacy was, attempt to secede from the Union. And then you have Donald Trump, who has called a lot of other people traitors, including just now in the last 24 hours, has called President Obama a traitor. His predecessor, his immediate predecessor, who it won't escape either one of your notice, is African American. So I just give me a little bit on this, how incredibly interesting it is that Donald Trump sees Confederate generals and politicians as statues, the actual traitors. We need to keep those statues up. And President Obama is the one in his mind who is a traitor.
You know, Donald Trump keeps running against Barack Obama. And, you know, it's all about race. And he's using Obama as a race cue. And he is, to Eugene's point and his really important piece, this is fundamentally about how are we as a country coming together as we become more demographically diverse. So he's playing on the fears of people who are white about belonging in the United States. As the demographics of the country change, as more people of color, including people who are black, start to be seen in positions of power, start to gain positions of power, still struggle for positions of power, and all he can do is play to our basest elements. And remember that this is a presidency that not only did he stoke hate during the campaign and stoke violence and stereotyping, he has continued to do it into his administration. And those who track hate have also tracked the increase in hate crime since this presidency took the White House. So frankly, this is really just a base, an un-American way of talking about race when the country as a whole, including Republicans, 6 out of 10, are saying, let's grapple with this, let's deal with it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.